what we want to do here is not have another lecture. We want to have a discussion. For that to happen, you're going to have to be a part of this. And so the next slide up here, if we can advance the slide to this phone number, this number is a Google Hangout number, which means when you text, it'll come to my phone, but it's anonymous, so I won't trace it back. I won't look you up. You won't get in trouble. You can ask any question you want, but I'm going to ignore all of them that don't have anything to do with the Great Commandment. So don't ask me about Calvinism, because remember, I can't remember all those points. But what I'd like to do is I would like to, as moderator, kick these over and for us to have a discussion based on your questions, starting with the most important relationship you'll ever have, the covenant relationship you have with Jesus. And so what I'd like for you to do is take your phone or computer or whatever and just start texting questions about that. Also be thinking of questions about marriage, about the expectations of a pastor's wife, anything related to home, and about pastors' kids. I found in doing these roundtables and pastor date nights that there's a lot of fear among ministers and among ministry spouses because we're the only occupation that has in our job description that we're to do a good job at home or we're fired. And so if we mess up our marriage, if our kids are messed up, there comes this fear as, am I no longer qualified? Am I supposed to still do this? And sometimes our members have those questions. And so we want to talk about PKs. Those relationships are important because as Great Commission Christians, if we want to turn the world upside down, and we do, but our world is upside down, then you have a disconnect. And so we want to encourage you in those, but we want the questions to come from you. Does that make sense? And then when he says to love with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, he said it to Moses, he said it in New Testament, Old Testament. This is protos and megos, first and greatest. In this opens the door, heart, soul, mind, and strength for physical and emotional and mental health. And so if you have questions about that, those are questions that are inbound. Any questions inbound, all right? So already I can feel my phone's blowing up. I love this. This is going to be a lot of fun because the questions come from you. All right. Now be patient with me because you guys are awesome at this already. I can tell. First question is actually from one of my favorite students. I do have a favorite student here. It is, I'm not going to say his name because it wouldn't be anonymous then, but my favorite student is my best friend's son, and he is here. And so he wants to know about, do you separate your time in study from time in personal devotion? That's a very good question. And so, Brian, would you start us off talking about how you separate, if you separate those?
That's a good question. Well, I don't think it's an either or. So as you're preparing to preach and you're studying the Word and you're praying and you're interacting with the Lord as you're preparing to preach, hopefully that's going to be a spiritually enriching experience that you have. If it doesn't, then there's something that you need to check with your sermon prep, whatever that is. But I do think where a lot of pastors grow weary in preaching is that they're relying solely on that sermon prep for their soul to be fed by God and to commune with Christ in some way. So so what I try to do is make sure my heart and my mind is engaged in my sermon prep. But I may do some serious soul work on my own that I need to do that has nothing to do with my sermon prep. It may have nothing to do with reading a long passage. It may have to do with me needing to go sit in silence for an hour and just pray and see what's going on in my soul and what I'm aware of that's going on in my soul. And so I would encourage everybody to see that both those things need to be present. They weave together, but what is most neglected, I've found, is the soul work that needs to be done even outside of prep and everything else in regard to the work of the ministry. So it's both, but I would encourage you to make sure you're doing the soul work necessary. And that may look very different than what your preparation to teach or preach might be.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, well, all of it. I want to just underscore what Mark Dever said a couple weeks ago when he was here for the Mullins lectures. He was talking to preachers, but I think there's an application for all of us, whether you're an every Sunday preacher or not. But I would definitely make my sermon prep time, everything I'm teaching, whether it's Sunday school or midweek, and make that part of your devotional life. So I would purposely overlap those things because it's just ministering to your soul then. And you're preparing, think of a sermon, for example. You're preparing that sermon first by preaching it to yourself. And you hear about that a lot, but how do you actually do that? Well, start every day devotionally reading that text, meditating on that text, praying that text, memorizing that text. And that's not only efficient, that's just good for your soul, and I think it's going to give you power in your preaching and your teaching. So I like efficiencies, and so I like to find areas where I can work smarter, not harder. But it's way more than that. It's also just to minister to my soul, so I'm ministering to others out of overflow and leveraging what I'm doing. Hopefully, if you're at a Bible church or if you're at a church that is, what did Dr. Scroggins say today, the people that come and visit, they're like, you take the Bible seriously. And that's good. If you're at a church that does that, leverage all that work you're doing and make it part of your devotional life. Yeah.
All right, so there are a lot of questions about a pastor's marriage and kids, and we're going to get to those. So thank you for those. And, I mean, these are very good. You know, I'm getting some overlap questions, and these are good as well. But one question related is kind of a segue question to personal worship is how does the family worship look like for each one of you with your wife before you had children and then once you had children? Very good question.
And unfortunately, I apparently have to start this one since I didn't have to the last one. My answer probably makes Don Whitney hang his head in shame, okay? So, what did it look like before my kids came along? Honestly, I was terrible at it. We were bad at it. We were just bad at it. If by family worship you mean I sit down with my wife and I read devotion, I read the text to her, and then she makes comments to me, and then we sort of bow our heads and pray together. That's beautiful. That's great. I am not disparaging that at all, but we just were never good at that, okay? But here's what we were good at. We were consistent in our own personal walks with the Lord, and we were always talking about the things of the Lord. I honestly think that's the more important thing in terms of the marriage, right? Of having no sphere of life that's kind of not touched by Jesus. Like, it was never awkward for us to regularly be talking about spiritual things, okay? So that was sort of before children, and you guys can rebuke/correct as you need to. But with kids, I mean, every family is going to do it differently, but you have to be, I'm going to talk to dads especially here. The dads have to be the one to bear the weight of the discipline, okay? Some families do it 7 nights a week. We don't do it 7 nights a week. We just, with the ebb and the flow of different activities and my work schedule and travel schedule and things like that, we shoot for 3 to 4 times a week, and by God's mercy and grace, we're very consistent with that. So that's just to give you an idea of the footprint on the week. I think sometimes the perfect or the ideal is the enemy of the good, right? So we think unless I'm doing it 7 days a week, I'm not doing it at all, and then you get discouraged and you don't do it at all, right? So I don't think we want to think that way. So what just works for us in this particular stage of our family is, after everybody gets done cleaning up dinner, we then sit on the couch and I open the Bible with them. I have a range of children who are from 11 years old down to 3 years old. If I do devotions for the 11-year-old only, then the 3-year-old gets nothing. If I do devotions for the 3-year-old, then the 11-year-old sort of rolling her eyes, wondering what God has to do with her life, right? So what we do is, it's just a challenge for me to be a good Bible reader myself, is we'll do a combination of children's Bibles for the little kids, and then I'll choose a book that I have gone through recently in my own devotional life that I then do with everyone, the little kids sitting in there too. And my goal in that time is I read the Word to them, and I make 1 to 2 observations of the text that are simple, that are straightforward, and that I directly relate in some way to their lives. And guys, we're not talking super insightful here. We're not talking about deep exegetical points. We're talking about, I want them to have a vision that this thing that Daddy opens in front of them has something to do with their experience, with their life. Then we pray, and that's the end of it. You guys probably sing and do it a lot better than I do, but that's how we do it.
We've been friends a long time, but I'm embarrassed that we're friends now. You know, that you don't do this 7 days a week, and I'm
going to leave now.
I appreciate Jeremy sharing that, because I think it is one of the things we're talking about is this perception that the pastor and his family and his life is supposed to be at this elevated place, but the problem is it causes pastors to not be genuine and transparent with their congregations. So I'm grateful for what he said, and I can echo that. I was a pathetic husband in the first few years of my marriage. Didn't even do anything. I wasn't leading. I wasn't doing anything well in that way. When children started coming along and started to be challenged in some of these ways, we started having time where I would read the Word at dinner, because we had little kids, and those of you who can like round your kids up in their jammies and sit next to the fire right before bed, God bless you. My kids were all over the place. I couldn't pull it off. So I figured, okay, they're doing something when they're eating at the dinner table. And so we would sit down, and I would actually read the Word as they're sitting and eating at dinner, and that occupied them when they were younger. And we actually ended up having a spiritual conversation when they're little through that. And so that set a good precedent for the next several years for us. But I would also read the passage typically that I was preaching that Sunday, because I saw that as a golden opportunity to prepare my kids to sit in the service and hear my sermon if they knew the passage and they kind of even knew the direction I was going. And they actually helped me with my sermon prep at times. You know, to hear a 7 or 8-year-old give his take on the passage kind of helps you know how to preach to an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old in your congregation. So that became the pattern eventually, but I was very bad at that and doing anything at all for the early years of my marriage, and even when my first couple of kids were in the early years of their life. So,
Boy, I'm similar too. And let me try to add a little separate value here. Some of you might be engaged, some of you might be dating. So I would just encourage you to start these disciplines now, because what you're doing in dating and engagement, you want to carry that into your marriage. My late wife, Julie, and I, we started dating when I was in ministry, just before seminary, but it was just so natural for us to incorporate whatever I was teaching on or preaching on. We both just came through Bible, church milieu, so we just love the Word of God. When we started incorporating prayer into our dating and engagement, and of course, you're not living together. You got to pick your spots, right? When can you do that? But in marriage, it was so wonderful to start as much as we could. It wasn't every 7 days a week, but by and large, we'd start our days with word and prayer, word and prayer. And I just want to encourage you here. I'm just a simple guy. We would do, for a long time, it was the NIV. Can I say that? I mean, it was the 1-year Bible. Tyndale, I think, published it. It was just a 1-year Bible, and we would just read a chapter in the morning. Not a lot of commentary. I mean, we'd read it, and then we'd pray, usually inspired by the text we were reading. And then I like to think bookends. I mean, Julie and I, we would start our day word and prayer and end our day word and prayer. And real simple. Didn't have devotional books, and we were reading things individually, but usually not going through a book together, though you could. I think it'd be great. That carried over into kids. When 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4 kids came along, we leveraged morning and evening. And not just because Spurgeon did. I think that's good to do for other reasons. And just the 1-year Bible. Again, we keep it simple. Now I'm going Robert Murray McShane's work, and I'm not legalistic about it. We don't always get through the 4 chapters in a day. But morning and then evening, word and prayer with the kids. So, for example, this morning, my kids at breakfast, we're going through, if you're in McShane's, we're in John 19 this morning, some of you, yeah, nodding. And that's all I did with the kids, and we just walked through the crucifixion, even though we just had Easter. I thought, you can never get tired of that story. So we read that, prayed, went on into our day, and we'll do something tonight. And I'm not always sure what I'll do. I'm going to pick something out of my daily reading with McShane and close their day with word and prayer.
All right, there's some really good questions in here, and some good input here. as we continue, we're going to move specifically to marriage in this conversation. Before we do, when I was a seminary student here, I was pastoring a church I planted in Tennessee and coming in for the 3-week seminars. And so there weren't a lot of younger students there. But with this one young guy from California, he couldn't go back home for whatever, I don't remember when, Christmas or spring break or whatever. So I was just talking to him, and I said, why'd you come to Southern Seminary? And he's from California. I mean, he even had the long blonde hair, had the whole kind of thing. And he said, well, I wanted to experience the Southern culture. Not Southern Seminary culture, the culture of the South. And I thought, well, it's a little farther north than what it sounds. It does, it's in Kentucky, barely. It's in the South. But, it's the Southern. And we just started talking about his life, and I was reading the one-year Bible, and in the NIV, that was before I repented and gave my heart to Holman Christian Standard. But but I just asked him, what do you, just conversationally, what's your Bible, what's your plan, And he said, honestly, I don't read the Bible every day. I don't have a plan. And I just assumed that everybody on this campus loved Jesus and was growing and read the Bible every day. It was just one of those things you just assume, which since then I realized that I wasn't always growing. And my love for God wasn't always going north. So I said, if I give you my one-year Bible, will you read it? And he said, yes. Now, I don't know his name. I didn't follow up with him. That was 20-something years ago. But I'll never forget that. And so I never make that assumption with people in the ministry that they're healthy spiritually and their love for Jesus is growing. But it was 10 years ago on a sabbatical, actually, where what I like to think of as a face mask moment, where a coach gets and you can't do this legally anymore, but, it used to be football. They grab your face mask, and when a coach had your face mask, he had your undivided attention, all right? And so this is what Jesus did with the Great Commandment. There's nothing more important ever. There's nothing greater than this. Nothing you'll ever do, whether you're a pastor, if you're a believer, than loving Jesus. And so that becomes the first part of your day, the first part of your week. And you can over-categorize and legalize whether it's sermon-related or Bible study-related or kids-related. Just be in the Word every day, all right? And let your love grow. Now, the term neighbor, that was one question. Neighbor's not, it can be used from neighbor. Your neighbor is a global neighbor. We'll talk about that all week. And so your neighbor is anyone with a need. But it's also used in proximity as well. And so for the sake of just clarity in 1 Timothy, the priority in our life is Jesus first. In my life, it's Jesus and Janet. It's easy for me to remember, Jesus and Janet. And whenever I loved Janet more than Jesus, it didn't help Janet at all. And then we had kids. And here's a seasonal thing. When you're growing in your marriage or your relationship with God, what you did before you got married, which was one of the questions, and what you do after you have a wife or husband or after you have kids is going to change a little bit in seasons. I'm empty nest now. So there's a lot of quiet in our house. But allow some grace in how you do things in these seasons. But your first priority is your covenant with God, and the second is covenant with your spouse. The third is the kids. And it might be that you need to demote somebody in your life. It might be your spouse needs a demotion. If you're loving your spouse more than you're loving the Lord. If you're loving your kids more than your spouse, your kids need a demotion. So those kind of things, these are sequential. But neighbor can also mean that lost person around the globe or across the street as well. All right, one question here. This comes up a lot about time management. How do you balance time with your church and all the ministry visiting, et cetera, and your family? How do you win at home and at church? I know you guys get this a lot. I love Brian Croft. He writes a lot about practical shepherding. And I'm going to make sure that you get all. In fact, tell me what your resources they can get to stay connected with you. And then if you could address this question, that would be awesome.
Okay, you want me to do the resources?
Yeah.
That you're talking about?
Yeah.
Practicalshepherding.com was where a lot of our resources are. the pastor's family is the main resource we have on this topic that some of you got when you came in. So, but that can be the best place to find information. We're trying to fill gaps where there are gaping holes in practical resources. So I'm never going to write a book on preaching because I could list 8 or 10 great books on preaching I would have you read. But you'd be amazed that there was nothing on how to do hospital visitation. There was hardly anything on how to do a funeral and balance, how do you preach the gospel and yet care for those people who are grieving. So we're trying to fill the gaps in the practical resources that we find are missing in most places. So that's what that's about if you want to visit there. As far as time management with family, it's tough. But what I found is the struggle with time management was in regard to neglecting my family for ministry, were issues of my own soul that were going on, not bad time management. That was a symptom of what was going on in my own heart. So, for example, if fear of man dominates you in your ministry, then you're going to feel compelled to have to be gone that night to something else or another meeting that somebody at the church wants you to be at, even though you don't think you need to be there. You will sacrifice your family to go and try to please that person instead of having a discernment and wisdom to know, I was gone the last 2 nights, and I'm just going to say no. So doing your own soul work to know what you're driven by. You want to feel significant. You fear what other people think of you. You want to be successful in people's eyes. All those things are traps and warnings that will cause you to neglect your family. So I would encourage you to do that work first. That will help you give discernment on how you balance it. As far as balance, it's probably the best advice maybe I've ever gotten is there's always another ministry, but you only get one wife. So if you truly consistently live your life that way, you can pour yourself out in ministry, but you will know when it's time to care for your wife first and your kids first and say no to ministry when you need to say no. And I have found at least most men function in a very narcissistic way in the ministry. And so our problem is not giving ourselves to ministry. Our problem is neglecting our families as we're giving ourselves. So the balancing act I try to find is knowing I need to check myself and say, is it time for me to maybe take a hit and tell the church I can't do this because I need to be home with my family this time? There are those that swing the other way, but typically men as pastoral ministry are driven to want to please their church and do the ministry they're called to do at the expense of their families.
You want to jump in? You sure? We'll just go in order. We're orderly guys.
We are orderly.
I think it starts with a vision and giving that vision to yourself constantly and to your family. One of the hardest things for me to come to Southern Seminary a year ago to teach was my kids loved being pastors' kids. I have no horror stories. By God's grace, they didn't want to leave their church. They loved being PKs. They wore that with pride and hopefully a sanctified pride. They loved it. The church was so good to them. They loved Dad being a pastor. And I think a lot of that is because Julia and I, from the earliest stages of our children, we were in ministry and we were setting a vision for them that we're in this together. So you start there. You don't start with this idea that Dad's going to work and then he'll get time later for wife and kids. You're either all in, or I would recommend get out and go do something else where you can punch the clock and do an 8 to 5. You've just got to make peace with this isn't an 8 to 5, and you don't want to be. You don't want to be, and your kids want to buy into that vision, and you, by God's grace, can help them see that. So I think if you start there, that covers a multitude of problems with family feeling like they're getting shortchanged. Now, there's very real issues. You got to make sure you're present and available for your wife and kids, but I just think that the best pastor's home is when you are all in this together. You have a vision for ministry that includes wife and children. Even if your wife doesn't play the piano, it's okay. She doesn't have to. And even if your kids, whatever, but just you're all in it together. And even you get into ministry because you love Jesus and you love people, right? That's what's driving you. And you want to share that with your wife and kids. And you want to be a family that is together in different roles, going to help that church grow up in love to God and love to neighbor. And so, a million questions we can talk about how you actually manage that throughout the week. But I would start with the vision that you need to cast.
That's good. So I love what these brothers said. Let me say the same thing, just packaged a little bit differently, okay? Time management is an act of humility, okay? That's how you have to think of it, as an act of humility. In other words, you are recognizing that you are not God in capacity, okay? That means you have to sleep, you have to eat, you have limitations. And you are not God in authority, meaning you don't get to choose what your life is about. So, what that means is you have to make the types of decisions that recognize I have to rest and I have to have times of rest with my family, okay? That's the capacity issue. And then the second thing is I don't get to just sort of casually say yes to all of the things that I want to do to reach my dreams. There are things that you must, as an act of faith, say no to, okay? And we're not very good at that, okay? Now, what my brothers were saying here was really helpful. I want to draw attention to the main hindrance I've seen to this humility, to being humble, with folks preparing for ministry, men and women, is this, especially in sort of this millennial generation, and I can kind of claim quasi-millennial status. I was born in 1979. 1980 is the cutoff for millennials, okay? So I'm kind of in the generation that many of you are in. But the two things that we love are accomplishment and amusement, okay? So what Brian was saying to us sort of dealt with the accomplishment thing. You're going to want to say yes to 1,000 things because that's going to be like the one hot opportunity that if you say no to, you're going to miss the train and your life's going to be meaningless and you're going to be shepherding 20 people in the hills of West Virginia, okay? Which, by the way, is a fantastic
Is that a
calling.
problem?
Okay. That's right. That's right. If that's God's calling for you, then there is an eternal weight of glory there, okay? So don't be so driven by having to get an A in every category of your life that you get a D in your relationship with God.
That's good.
Okay? So that's the accomplishment thing that's been well spoken of. Let me say a word about the amusement thing. This is the weird thing about time management for us, is we're like super busy, but a lot of us still binge watch Netflix. How does that work? Because what we're doing is, instead of scheduling in as an act of humility times of rest that honor God, we sort of work ourselves to the bone, and then we have this natural impulse, well, I need rest, and I'm going to smash and grab it wherever I can. And you end up doing it in things that don't truly bring true rest to your soul. So you watch an episode, and they have that hook at the end. Man, I got to find out what happens to Jack, right? Whoever it is. The main characters are always named Jack for some reason. Jack. And so you watch the next episode, and you're like, okay, I don't have to be up that early tomorrow. You watch another one, and before you know it, this drive to be amused and distracted and escape from the pressures of your schedule is what kind of gets you tired and leaves you spent for then going back into it. That's not taking ownership of your rest, okay? That's not taking ownership of, this is something I'm going to do as an act of worship to refresh my soul, to prepare me for further work, okay? And so I just would warn you, young pastors get in this weird quandary of they do want to please their church, they do want to conquer the world, they do want to say yes to everything, and therefore they're saying no to the God and their families. But then those same pastors often are reading ESPN for 45 minutes in the middle of the day when they should be working or something like that because they haven't scheduled their rest, okay? So that's just a tip that I've been thinking about a lot lately.
That's good stuff. We have a lot of questions, so we're going to take them one question at a time. I mean, as far as instead of all answering each one, we'll never get there. This is going to be a fast one. When someone said that if you have you're preaching on marriage, love, or joy before you leave the house, you and your wife have a huge disagreement. It's called a fight where I grew up, and how do you deal with that as you approach the pulpit to deliver God's word to God's people? Okay, real easy. In the ministry, whether you're preaching or teaching on Sunday morning, don't look at your wife, don't talk to your wife, don't drive with your wife, get out of the house before anything bad can happen. That's all I got. That's all I got. You're in no state of mind to solve problems on Sunday morning, so just get out of the house. All right? I have a pre-marriage question. How many of you are not married? Raise your hand. Not married. All right. Okay, so all this will apply later, but we do have a right now question as well. As a young man who's unmarried, what are some important traits to look for in a pastor's wife? And Mike, I'm going to ask you to deal with that.
Yeah, godliness, love for the Lord and love for people. If those things are there in abundance, get married. No, I don't know if that's the reason. But really, I wouldn't look first and foremost for certain skill trait. I mean, my Julia, she just loved the Lord and loved people, and she had the gift of hospitality off the charts. To me, it was just a wonderful gift for ministry. But I fell in love with her godliness, her pursuit of Christ. And then that looked like something in her horizontal world. She just loved people. So I can handle that one quickly, I think, and look for those things.
It's a very important question. There are a lot of pastors over the years. I was a pastor for 27 years, and I've hired a lot. There are a lot of guys that I'd love to hire that I didn't because of their wife. And it's just be very, very careful. In the case of, I think, you want to change the world, find a world changer who will go anywhere. Doesn't mean they have to be called a missionary, but if they're not willing to go anywhere, then I'd stop dating that person. So, I mean, the whole priority thing is just a matter of who's first. And if Jesus is not first before you get married, don't expect him to be first afterwards. Yes, sir.
So I agree with you. I want to kind of take the other side to that with what I've watched. I think taking it too far, the other side. There's nothing less romantic to try to pursue a woman, man, and say, I love you, but you got to be this, and this, because I'm going to be a pastor, so are you good? I want to remind you that there are qualifications for a pastor in the Bible, but not a list for his wife. So be mindful of what Dr. Pullman has said and about godliness and those qualities that, pursue and love the qualities of that woman and the things that you love about her or him, if you're a woman pursuing another man. Love the things about him or her, by who they are, because ministry may come and go, but you're going to be with them, hopefully, until death parts you. So I just want to encourage you men to, the woman that you want to marry, you will want her to feel like you want to marry her because of who she is, not because of the pastor's wife you may make for you. So I just want to caution that and make sure that's the priority, your deep love for her. And I've found many of those things fall into place, sometimes not, as you're talking about. But again, I've found the things I fell in love about my wife has made her a great pastor's wife. But she doesn't fit the cookie-cutter pastor's wife, but still those things have been very fruitful in our life and ministry.
Okay, so there's a question about marriage that I want to put out. These are the kind of questions I like. Let's get raw and real. One person says, my wife needs counseling or biblical counseling, but we have a good relationship, but she seems tone deaf to my voice. Is it normal for spouses to, and I don't really understand the rest, incline their ear, and then I don't have the rest of that sentence. But let's talk about when let's talk about Christian counseling for the married couple. And I'm not going to, if anybody wants to grab this one,
I think that naturally is something I ought to grab at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
So the question was sort of from the angle of a husband wondering about how to pursue counseling for the wife. I would want to encourage that gentleman to realize that troubles in human life are always contextual, okay? Meaning, you need counseling too.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right.
So there may be some significant issues of tone deafness to her sort of hearing pleas. You know, there may be some genuine resistance and lack of submission in her heart towards your leadership. That absolutely might be the case, okay? But brother, and brothers who are married and going to be married someday, your responsibility is to wash her in the Word and to love her in an understanding way as a co-heir of the grace of life with you, okay? So what that means is this. We all have this tendency to create our spouse or try to influence and manipulate our spouse and craft them after our own image, okay? Our own image of what we want them to be, all right? Now, here's the tricky part. A lot of what you want them to be comes from here. But a lot of what you want them to be comes from here, okay? And so we have a tendency to kind of warp into our own desires. We take good godly things and we kind of twist them and warp them and then cast them as expectations on the other person, okay? I'm writing a book proposal on marriage right now, and I'm thinking about calling it My Mythical Marriage, okay? Because we create myths, we create ideals, and then we sort of force the other one into it, okay? So I would just say, if a wife is being resistant to spiritual direction and sort of being resistant to seeing her need for sort of help in a particular way, then I don't think the solution is let's find the way to kind of trick her into counseling, okay? I think the solution is you model for her what it means to increase in your own self-awareness, your own awareness of your need for God, and lead her that way. Lead her on sort of a journey of what God is doing in you to expose things that need to be changed that you did not realize before, right? And as you're doing that, invite her along. Create a context, in other words, in your marriage where it's safe to have things wrong with you, okay? And know that grace is going to be provided. So beyond that, I mean, we could talk about the practicalities of have a good pastor in her life, have a good ladies at church who are mature and wise. You know, slowly but surely, just again, set a culture where it's normal to talk about our problems with people who are going to be responsible and care for us. Show humility yourself, and you make it much easier for her to be humble.
So, in light of wanting to be raw and honest, I just want to share a snippet of my own story for the person who asked this question. So, my wife and I are coming out of about 2 years of counseling that we've just begun to transition out of. My wife had a very dark depression of about 3 years ago, and that she just was not coming out of. So, you know, she went to counseling, and, you know, and I helped with this process, you know, to fix her. And I went to the counseling and found out that there were some things going on that had nothing to do with me. There were some things going on that I was crushing her. And my ministry and my schedule was crushing her. And I've gone through the last 3 years with some of the darkest times of my own soul work that I've had to do. So whoever asked that question, I would encourage you to see that as an option, that you're just as broken as your wife, and you actually may be part of the problem, even a big part of the problem, like I was. So if you go to counseling, make sure you go and help somebody sort through whether you are helping your wife in her struggles or if you're actually causing the problem.
Yeah, and look, I mean, guys, it's not always clear, honestly, because there are things I think in my marriage where my wife can sort of express concerns about me in my life, or I can have concerns that I privately have about my wife, and I don't know what is the line between me trying to craft her to respond to the Bible or respond to conviction for sin or something in a way that I would so that I feel better, right? And then what is genuinely a biblical expectation that she needs to grow in, right? So we're just very different. My wife is very task-oriented. She's very sort of list-oriented. She's very business, okay? I am very sort of relationally oriented. When I'm convicted for sin, you'll see tears. You'll see anguish. You'll see hyperbolic statements of how evil and terrible I am, okay? With my wife, when she's convicted with sin, I don't think I've ever seen her cry out of conviction for sin. That used to really bother me because I thought the Holy Spirit's not really working in her as he ought to work. And for the longest time, I was exerting my influence over her in a way that was, Brian used the word crushing, that was crushing her, rather than saying, wait a second, how do I pull back and ask the honest question, what does the Holy Spirit's convicting work look like in the container of my wife? And how's that different than the container of me? Does that make sense? So again, it's recognizing brokenness. It's recognizing our tendencies to read other people in light of how we naturally respond to situations.
I appreciate you asking the question, and then you guys being transparent in that. There's a lot of stigma and fear. One of the questions is about fear in ministry, fear of man, and I was asked to talk about that. I think this is a good time to do that. When related to the marriage or kids, sometimes the kids need counseling or whatever. About 2009, I asked my wife a question one day. I said, I noticed something was different about me. I noticed that, for example, I was pastoring a church. We were growing and starting a new campus and just doing lots of cool things. But inside, I was just numb. And so I asked my wife, I said, do you think I'm clinically depressed? She thought for a second. And she said, nah. She said, our daughter was going through, some normal yet scary rebellion. And most kids go through some season of rebellion. And, and there were some things at church that weren't great. And it was just bad stuff. And everybody gets depressed. Everybody at some point will get depressed. Not everybody stays depressed. I'd never been stuck before. And I realized something. My wife was not a mental health professional, and neither was I. Here you had two non-professionals trying to self-diagnose. And I don't do that with medical problems. I don't ever ask her, honey, do you think I have cancer? What do you think? So I said, I think I'm going to talk to my doctor. We'd been to China a couple times on medical teams. And so he asked me a handful of questions that they ask people about that, and, insomnia and paranoia and some of those things. I don't remember what they were, but I was yes on everything. So he said, this is normal, guy, 20 years in the ministry, driven like you are. And he gave me a minor dose of some kind of medication that kind of a pseudo serotonin, a happy hormone. I didn't understand that either. But I didn't like me and nobody else did either. That's all I could say. And 1 week later, now no one had ever suggested depression for me. I was very functional. I could preach and counsel. I could still be on, and pastors have an on button, and I could turn it on. But I was dead inside. And so one week after talking to my doctor and him saying, you're clinically depressed, and here, we'll walk through this, a member of my church that was fairly new and about 20 years older, she's a licensed therapist, mental health therapist. She asked if she'd come by my office, and she only had 2 questions. Never said anything about depression. She didn't know I met with my doctor. She said, 1, do you know that you're clinically depressed? I said, yes, ma'am, I do. And she said, oh, good. Because she thought I was going to do that whole preacher dance. No, I'm fine. Everything's fine, Second question, are you taking anything for it? I said, yes, ma'am, I am. She goes, oh, good. Because she thought, he's not going to want to take anything because that'd be unspiritual. And apparently she'd gotten that kind of response before. And I said, well, I don't know if it works. I just got it. I just started taking it 2 days ago. And I met with her. I continued to be the pastor of that church, came out of that depression inside of a year. Mine was temporary and treatable. But let me tell you something. Self-diagnosing is dangerous because there were 2 people on my staff at that same time who had a different form of depression. One was chronically and one was bipolar. Both attempted suicide in that same year, and one of them succeeded. The other one that didn't succeed lost his marriage and then a second marriage right after, and both of them were in their 30s with young children at home. And so my depression was common cold compared to theirs. And so for them, their medication, they weren't going to come out of it in a year, right? But the fact is, my testimony is this. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Whether it's a physical problem, a mental health problem, a spiritual problem, pastors sometimes will isolate ourselves, and pastor spouse even more so, because they're afraid of the stigma and they're maybe afraid of being looked down on. So when I shared it a few months after I'd been into medication, my head's gotten clear, I shared it with my church on a Sunday morning. Talk about afraid, exposing my secret. And they start applauding and standing and pouring down the aisles. Now, this is a Southern Baptist church. I mean, you have to have an excuse to clap in church. I mean, but they were coming down here, hugging on me, and then I'd do it in another service. And the fact is, I, as a pastor, let them pastor me. And if you really are a part of your church family, then be family. And I love the fact that these guys live in this grace zone. You don't have to act perfect or be perfect. Your marriage doesn't have to be perfect. Your kids don't have to be perfect. And perfectionism can be an idol. But reaching out for help takes guts and takes initiative. Whether it's your wife that's struggling, your kids are struggling, you that are struggling, just encourage you to ask people that know more than you do about that. Okay? All right, let's talk about a couple of other things, these questions about pastors' kids for a while. You guys have, how many kids, tell me each of you, how many kids you have and what are the age ranges?
I got 5, 11 is the oldest, 4 is the youngest. Everybody's even in between.
Okay. I've got 4. Oldest, my Sam is 16, my daughter is 15, Anna, and then Johnny's 13, and Michael's 8.
I'm right here. So I have 4. Samuel's 16, Abby's 14, Isabel will be 12 in about a week, and then Claire is 9.
I have 2, 19-year-old and 22-year-old. I kicked Scroggins off the panel because he had 8, and I was already looking bad. So, I'm not practicing dominion like, filling the earth, and so that in the in the PK realm. Any PKs here? Got any PKs? All right, you got like halfway up. Missionary kids? You missionary kids? All right, cool. Well, I married a PK, and so she's never been out of the pastor's home her entire life, and now she's ministering to pastors' wives. It's a lot of fun. But PK's, that's one of the questions about that is also related to marriage. Is what if you're not in agreement about how many kids to have? What do you do about that? That's a great question. It's a hard question too.
Well, I can't speak to that because we just agreed we wanted more and couldn't. So I mean, we didn't have that issue, but I'm sure you've heard it or.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the questions that I've helped couples walk through is less how many kids we want and more what do we do about birth control and what's the responsible God-honoring thing to do. So the one that comes to mind, honestly, is, well, let me give the principle first and then I'll give the thing. I think the principle is that a husband has the responsibility to serve his family well by expressing dominion in the particular way that God has called him to in his context and in his calling. Okay? So what that means is, I mean, what I just said was super generic and could be applied like in a trillion different ways. Well, that's the point. The Bible doesn't give you a chapter and verse on, all right, if you grew up in rural Ohio and you make over $30,000 a year, 3 kids, that's how much I have to have. Okay, so that's decided. God doesn't, yeah, that's right. God doesn't give you those references. So it's these theological principles that you then have to prayerfully seek wisdom on how to apply. So, with the situation I'm thinking of, the husband really did believe any attempt to prevent pregnancy was dishonoring to God. The wife was on kid number 6 and was about to kill her husband, which would have dishonored God. Okay.
That's a no-no.
That's right. But what I said, my basic thrust with this guy was to not convince him necessarily of my understanding of compatibilistic freedom, right? My view of birth control, okay? And things, though I did give him that reasoning from Scripture. But my main goal with this husband was to say, it is wrong for you to think that this is just some sort of private calculation that you do between you and God, and you arrive at your view of birth control, and then you hand that down to your wife, and her job is to sort of submit and come along. That's not how it goes. What it goes is your primary job is to love and serve your wife. That's what it means for you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with the knowledge of God, right? So what that means is you have to involve her concerns, you have to involve her limitations, you have to involve the limitations of who she is in that equation. Doesn't mean that you automatically do whatever the first thing is that comes out of her mouth, but it does mean that influences and shapes the final decision that you make on, a given month or a given whatever it is. And honestly, they end up having another kid, but it was through a process where he involved her in it in such a way where there was more time given. He flexed on some of the sort of harder edges of it, and she was 100% on board by the time it came for them to have another kid. And so I'm thankful for that. But my point is, the main emphasis is on maintaining that covenant unity together and making decisions like that.
I have 4 kids, and I always said I wanted 2. So I'll let you guess on who won that conversation. But what happened with us is we decided to go one at a time and make decisions. So that would be just a practical tip, that if what happened to me is I thought I wanted 2, but then I realized how much I love having kids. So she didn't have to convince me of anything, even though she desired more than 2 kids. So I don't think you have to make that call when you're talking about starting your family. So one at a time, and listen to each other after each child, because you don't know how hard a wife's pregnancy will be. You don't know how difficult a child will be. All those things matter in what you can handle after that. So one at a time.
And never talk about having the next kid while she's in labor. That's bad.
Or the next day after she has a baby.
I don't know personally, but I just... And don't read ESPN on your phone while she's in labor either. I don't know that personally.
Y'all aren't writing that down, Okay, so mapping out a plan, whether it's a ministry plan, being where you're going to serve, what your job's going to be, how many kids you're going to have. You can dream together, but just know that God has a lot of sovereign surprises, and your commitment to her is not based on how many kids or where you serve. What's listed in the pastoral epistles in Timothy and Titus are characteristics, and they are listed. There are some for the pastor's wife as well as the pastor, but they're about character, not about job descriptions. And some of the questions are about that as well, the expectations of a pastor's spouse, and those need to be realistic. But this is where I think a male leadership is involved. It's clear in Scripture who the leader of the home is. And so sometimes there will be points of disagreement. There will be points of where you're at a stalemate. And there won't be a lot, hopefully. But when you're in an impasse like that, there's one primary leader of your home. And if you're the guy, it's you. And so that's pretty clear, in Scripture. But take that, take that seriously, and don't use that for everything. Don't use it for Diet Coke, Vanilla Coke, But on things of weighty matter, usually time will tell, and I agree with Brian. This is something that once you have a child, you prayerfully consider, and you do it together. When it comes to career decisions, for example, God's given a great deal of discernment to females. I do not understand it fully, but it's for real. All right, it's a real deal, and so. Listen to your spouse. If there's a red light or a yellow light on something, I take it very seriously from Janet, because she's usually right, and yet she's not always right. But usually the worst decisions are made when they're made quickly. And so there's a lot of times in the Bible, the Bible talks about waiting a lot. I hate to wait, but the Bible says a lot about that. All right? Now, Mike, this is good. I knew that you were coming just hours ago, but I'm thankful that you're here, and you've had to live through some vows that not all of us make, and with Julia, and if you could share a little bit about that, whatever God lays on your heart, I think this is one of those sovereign surprises, you being here.
Well, happy to, and I'll try to be mindful. I don't know what the end time is.
Yeah, we're very... Yeah.
Okay.
Very close.
I had the privilege of being married for 16 years to Julia. We met in high school. I was 14. She was 15. We were friends long before we were dating. It was in undergrad that we started dating. We both wanted to be in ministry. So a lot of my story, I don't know if it translates easily. We so many things were just natural and easy for us. I feel like God just burdened both of us for so many similar things, whether it was family or ministry. But we were married, and I was 24, she was 25. Right after marriage, and this probably isn't the best thing to do either, we went right to I was in seminary. I'd finished 1 year at TEDS and then transferred to Western Seminary in Portland. Her dad was fighting cancer at the time. Some great advice was given me by our pastor that married us, and this will be applicable to a lot of you perhaps, if not now, soon. He said, Mike, I'll marry you under the condition that you don't take a pastorate for 1 year. He said, Julia is your congregation. Focus on her that first year. And I was true to that vow. As God would have it, it was literally the 13th month where I took an interim position in my last year of seminary. But it bore so much fruit for us. I mean, Julia and I were able to really spend that year getting to know each other in the context of marriage, even though we had a lot of equity built up from knowing each other from a younger age. But it really helped set that foundation for, again, what was just a wonderful 16 years of marriage and 4 children together. 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, I did the hardest thing of my life. I mean, I did her graveside service. Dr. Vogel, some of you know him, he did the memorial service. I didn't want to speak at that. But Julia taught me so much. The main thing as far as ministry that she taught me is how other people focused she was. Julia, even with cancer, for nearly 5 years, battled stage 4 breast cancer. And even during that time, it was never about Julia. Sometimes I wanted to tell her, Julia, make this about you right now. But she just served until she couldn't serve anymore, whether it was me or the kids or her church and extended family. Just picturing the gospel in so many ways. She laid down her life until about 2 months before God was so kind to give her a really high quality of life for the most part. She was in such good shape when she was diagnosed at 37 that she handled the chemotherapy so well. I mean, that was the irony of it. She would often joke and say, if it wasn't for all these tumors, I'd be so healthy. And she was, and handled the treatment so well until about 2 months before, when she kind of had to shut some things down, and the church was kind to give me a leave. And so that would be the main lesson I learned from 16 years of marriage to Julia. And for a lot of you that are aspiring to be in ministry or are in ministry, service to God and others, even through suffering. And there's other tangents we could take here. How do you preach week in and week out, wondering what the MRI is going to yield or what the CT scan is going to yield? And I'll just tell you this. For 5 years, God never left me without a word on Sunday. And we just preached right through it. And some of the most powerful times for me in the pulpit were through the suffering, the uncertainty, the wondering, if this was going to be the week where Julia's tumors just took over. And I just want to encourage you, God meets you. He gives you a grace sufficient for the hour. And I'm a living testimony to that.
I just want y'all to hear that because, man, when you say those vows, some of you hadn't said them yet, you may have to live them out. And be prepared to live them out. They're important. Your most important member is always going to be your wife and your kids. And then there's a season, and I'm in it now, where your nearest one may not be your kids. My mother and father-in-law are moving to Nashville next month, and they're in their 80s, and my kids are still in Arkansas and in college, and so there's that season where your parents may need you more than your kids. Prioritizing them will sometimes be hard with your ministry. It will compete. There'll never be that ta-da moment where you totally feel good about the balance between work and home. But just remember that you need to sometimes receive that grace for yourself. Because I know that everyone here is struggling with something privately that somebody next to you doesn't know about. Everybody is. And we're not here because we're perfect, right? But don't let that be as a blank check for, to write off holiness at all. Still strive for it and be authentic with it. But just remember that ministry is way too hard to do alone. So share that. My best friend that I told you about, whose son is here, I won't embarrass him and point him out. We have been talking to each other every week since 1984. He's on my schedule. Today is that day that I talk to him every week. The reason we did that is because I saw our youth minister failed morally. The guy that preached the youth camp I was at, a different guy, also failed morally. The first church conference I went to is at Prestonwood. He had moral failure back in those days, and there were a bunch of in the 80s that were falling like flies. I was scared to death. And so Paul and I got together and said, let's hold each other accountable. Let's hold each other up. Let's be completely honest about everything. There's a no strut zone here because we need each other. We want to finish strong. We knew that most that started wouldn't finish for different reasons. And we're still going strong in ministry almost 30 years later. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're never alone. We don't have to be awesome all the time, have to be on all the time. And if you are in a place where you want to grow in your relationship with God, you want to keep growing, find somebody who's never going to be impressed with you that can push back and can help you grow, that can push back and help you when you and your spouse are not doing well, your kids are rebelling, or you're dealing with a physical or mental health issue. Paul told Timothy to preach the word in season and out of season, and with that comes the assumption that you will go through both. So don't be surprised, don't be shocked, as James says, when you go through trials, because you have a promise here today that you will go through bad seasons. Your church won't always grow, your marriage won't always grow, your relationship with God won't always grow. And so in those times, just know you don't have to stay in that season, okay? And be encouraged because this seminary is full of people who've given their lives to be that Aaron and her, that Barnabas to you, to lift you up and encourage you. They want to do more than just teach. They want to shepherd as well. And these three guys are great examples of that. Would you thank them for coming today? In your bag, you have a card. My business card's on there for any social media contact information you want. You can follow, and hopefully I can help you with things there as well. Any final thoughts, guys? Well, let's stand together, and I want to pray for you. Can I do that? Thank you for hanging with me, and I hope everybody enjoys the products. Please go by and check out these Lifeway friends. And yes, sir.
Guys, we do need to thank Mark and Lifeway for providing everything here, so let's go ahead and do that. You guys don't know what a gift Lifeway is to the Southern Baptist Convention as a whole and to the Southern Seminary in particular, so we're grateful for you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Pierre. Father, I pray your richest blessings on every man and woman standing here who's given their life to serve you. What a privilege it is to encourage them today, and I pray that going forward we can help. And pray for those who are not married, that you would send the right person into their life at the right time. For those that are married, strengthen their marriages and help them know the big decisions together during this time. And we pray all this in your powerful name, Jesus. Amen.